Acts 24, turn there, and we will jump right in. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. Actually, today and then next Wednesday, and then we will break until the first of the year. We always do that right before Thanksgiving. And if we get through today's lesson, which I anticipate we will finish up Acts next week. So it will end just as we take our break, which will be nice. We don't have to come back and pick up one chapter or two chapters. I'm going to teach, just so you know, I'm going to teach through the book of Hebrews starting in January. And I don't know that I've ever done that, at least not in any depth. So we'll start that in January. So Paul has been transported to Caesarea. He was in Jerusalem, and they were trying to kill him. They were trying to plot to take his life. And so when word was received that they were trying to kill him and take his life, they made arrangements to travel by night and get him to Caesarea where he would be protected. And so that's where we are going to pick up the story. He is in Caesarea. He will ultimately go to Rome. This is the last part of Paul's life. And I actually put it in your notes, many have described this as Paul's ministry in chains. And by ministry in chains, we mean he will spend the rest of his time in prison, in jail, but he will not quit ministry. He will continue to share the gospel even though he is imprisoned the rest of the book of Acts. Now, throughout this section, I put this in the note at the top. We're going to see how strongly the Jews oppose Paul. And the Jews are actually going to try to capitalize on the Romans' I say weakness. I'm not sure that's really the right term, but they don't really care that much. And the Jews are going to try to press the Romans and kind of catch them in a place where they'll go ahead and execute Paul. That's really what the Jews are shooting for. But Paul is going to use this every chance you're going to see along the way in his ministry in chains to witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's begin chapter 24, and we begin in verse number 1. After 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders, and a certain orator named Tertullus. Let me just stop there. You remember that what the Jews wanted is for them to transport Paul back to Jerusalem, because they thought if he comes back to Jerusalem, we'll have another chance to ambush him and kill him. But the governor said, no, we're not going to do that, but you are welcome to come here to Caesarea and hold the trial. So that's what's happening. They come down. Verse number 1, a certain orator named Tertullus, and these gave evidence to the governor, the governor is Felix, against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, seeing that through you we enjoy great peace, he's talking to Felix, and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accepted always and in all places most noble Felix with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you, Felix, to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him. He wanted to judge. Wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. So Paul is now in the hands of Felix the governor in Caesarea. But the Sanhedrin now comes to Caesarea, where they are going to hold a trial against Paul and lay out their charges against Paul. Tertullus is likely, he would be like the prosecuting attorney, all right? He's the legal expert for the Sanhedrin, and he is the one that is going to lay out the case. So if you like movies or old shows where there's an attorney that's standing up and either giving a defense or a prosecution, that's the picture you get here. And Tertullus is the one that is leveling the charges against the Apostle Paul. Notice how he begins with flowery rhetoric toward Felix. He kind of, most noble Felix, we're so thankful that we have prospered under your leadership. All he's doing is, he's just brown-nosing him. He's just trying to get him on his side and speaking very kindly and fondly of Felix's leadership and how much peace they had had under his tenure. The reality is, if you look up history, it doesn't lend that out at all. Felix's leadership was not a peaceful time, but I put this in your notes. How many know politics is always politics, right? So that's all he's doing. This is just a political maneuver to try to kind of ooze their way into Felix's decision-making. And he promises, I'm going to make this brief. That's what Tertullus says. If you just listen for a few moments, I'm going to get right to the point, and I'm going to make this brief. So here are the charges that are leveled against Paul. Empire insurrection. He stirs up riots. He's a troublemaker. He is the ringleader of all of the problems. That's what Tertullus says. Again, historical evidence points to the fact that the empire was always in chaos. There were always riots. There were always mobs that were gathering. However, it is undeniable that everywhere Paul went, he ruffled a lot of feathers, and there were some riots that occurred. We know about things that happened in southern Galatia, Corinth, Thessalonica, Ephesus. We've already talked about that. So it is a true statement that where this guy goes, there's trouble, but it's not really accurate to say he's really the reason. It's not anything wrong that he's done, but certainly that kind of context is following Paul. Then he says, not only that, Tertullus says, he also has disrupted us with his heretical teaching, and he accuses him of profaning the temple. If you weren't here a few weeks ago, you remember what that was all about. Paul went to the temple to pray. He had come to Jerusalem with a Gentile, but he had not taken the Gentile in the temple, but the Jews trumped up these false charges against him, saying that he brought the Gentile into the temple because if he profanes the temple, that is worthy of death. And so their hope was that they would get Paul on this capital offense and be able to kill him. And so he says that he has profaned the temple, and he is the leader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And this is the only place in the New Testament that this Greek word is used of Christians, but there is evidence that the Hebrews called the Christians that, all right? Even though that's the only time in the New Testament that that word is used in the Greek, it does seem like that's what they were calling first century Christians, is the Nazarenes. So the charges are broad, the charges are exaggerated, and the charges are unsubstantiated. That's really all we need to get out of those first 9 verses. He's on trial, he butters up Festus, and he really makes up a bunch of stuff, or at least he enlarges unsubstantiated charges. John? Yes. Yeah. Paul calls that, but the Hebrews generally called them the Nazarenes. And it's likely because Jesus was from Nazareth that they were calling, there were times that Jesus is called the Nazarene. This is the only time that Christians as a group are called that, but most likely because they were following Jesus, who I doubt it. Maybe it was. I don't know. I'm not sure. Very well could have been. So but it was not, really wasn't a derogatory term. It was just a descriptor term because Jesus was from Nazareth. So any other comments there? Just pretty simple first 9 verses. He's on trial. So now Paul gets a chance to defend himself. Verse 10, then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, so now it's his chance. He doesn't have an attorney. He's going to give his own. He's self-defending, all right? Evidently, he didn't get a public, what are they called, public defender. All right, he's just going to defend himself. So after the governor had nodded to him, Paul answered, and here's what he said, inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple, disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogue or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. So he begins, Felix says, Paul, it's your turn. So Paul begins, and he denies outrightly their charges. It's, again, really very simple. This is not a difficult text at all. It's just a narrative, and it's kind of what it is. But he denies outrightly their charges, and he actually boldly speaks to the governor, which is interesting because this is what Peter will later write that Christians are supposed to do if they find themselves in this kind of false accusation later on down the road. I put those verses on the top of page 2. This is 1 Peter chapter 3. And Peter is talking here about suffering. There's just suffering and there's unjust suffering. And Peter writes, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Don't fear their threats. Don't be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. And always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it's better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. So Peter says to Christians, if you get yourself in one of these situations where you are falsely accused, don't be afraid, be bold, but speak gently, speak kindly, always defend, always give a reason for the hope. Don't just say, well, I didn't do that. You're going to find out that Paul is going to give a reason for his hope. He's going to use this. These are his chains, his ministry in chains. He's going to talk about Jesus. And so he is following really the advice that Peter later gives. So Paul says to Felix, he said, you probably, as you start listening to things, you're going to ascertain when you, I'm trying to put this in our terminology, when you check my travel records and you look at my phone log, all right, you're going to ascertain, I've only been here 12 days. I was only in Jerusalem 12 days, not really time to cause the kind of ruckus that they are accusing me of causing. And really, if anyone caused a ruckus, it wasn't Paul. It was the people that mobbed against him. So he goes on in verse number 14 then, but this I do confess to you, that according to the way, that's what John was referring to, which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. So here's what Paul says. I didn't do what they said. I didn't profane the temple. I didn't cause a riot. If anybody caused a riot, it was them. But, Felix, I will tell you what I am doing. I am a follower of what they call the way. I am one of those Christians, all right? And I do, as a Christian, I follow the God of, and he's talking to Felix, of our fathers. I'm a Jew. I follow Yahweh. I trust the Word of God. I'm not trashing the law. And he said, I am with some of these others in this room, the Pharisees among you. I share the same hope that they share. That is in a resurrection. Pharisees did believe in that. And so Paul is saying, listen, I didn't profane the temple, and I didn't start a riot. Here's Paul saying to Felix, let me tell you why I'm really here. I'm really here to start with because I worship the same God they all worship, and you, Felix, are very aware of our rules, and I have the same hope they all have, and that is in a resurrection. And so what Paul is saying is, my worship has been the same. I have tried to live a clear conscience before the same God of these people and before man. And so what Paul is making the point here before Felix is, I have not betrayed the Old Testament at all. I've not betrayed Old Testament faith. So then he goes to verse 17, and he's going to respond to the temple charge. He says, now after many years, so now here's what Paul is saying. I just want to get you to understand. Paul says, let me tell you why I was in Jerusalem. Okay, they said I defiled the temple, but let me tell you what really would happen. After many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with a tumult. They ought to have been before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. So here's what Paul says. Felix, let's get right down to the truth here. He said, first of all, they weren't even eyewitnesses. They don't know. I was in Jerusalem. I was bringing offerings. I collected this from the churches of Achaia, the church of Corinth, churches in Macedonia. I was bringing offerings. That's why I was here. They found me purified in the temple. They didn't see any Gentile there. There was no Gentile with me. They made that all up. I was ceremonially clean because I had returned from the Jewish lands and I had been purified. He says, but I will tell you, I will own up to this one crime. I didn't profane the temple and I didn't create a riot. But I did say that one. It's kind of funny. He said, but there is that one thing I said, all right? That one thing I said about the resurrection. I'll own up to that. I preached the resurrection. I stood shouting and standing before them, and I did declare the resurrection and the hope of the dead. So in other words, what Paul is saying is, I'm going to own up to my crime, but to you Romans, Festus, it's not a crime at all. It's a matter of theology. This is why I'm here. You don't have anything to nail me to the wall for, because I didn't do anything. I didn't profane the temple. I didn't create a mob. It's a matter of theology that's really out of your jurisdiction in the first place. And to the first century, a resurrection hope, first century Jew, Pharisee, that wasn't odd. And so he is putting this in perspective. What I believed in, they're trying to nail me to the wall, that I really have not done anything other than what most of these Pharisees believed anyway. Not only was this a good defense, as I put in the notes, but it's also good evangelism because it gives him a springboard from which, see, right now he's talking about resurrection in general. He's not talking about yet the resurrection of Christ. He's talking about the Pharisees believed that there was life after death. They believed in a resurrection. The Sadducees did not. Remember when he split them down the middle because he talked about it? So right now he's saying, all I've done is I've talked about the resurrection. He knows that that's going to give him a platform to talk about a particular resurrection. And that's the resurrection of Jesus, which at the end of the day, that's what the Jews are ticked off about. It's not resurrection in general. It's about this one who was resurrected. So he gives his defense, and then Felix, as we will find, is typical of Felix, will procrastinate. When Felix heard these things, verse 22, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he reasoned about the righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. For when I have a convenient time, I will call for you." Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. There's a lot of politics, as I mentioned, going on here. So Felix says, "I'm not going to make a decision today. I've heard both sides, and both sides have rested their case. So we're gonna put this off for a while." And he delayed his decision really for two reasons. Number one, he was thoroughly aware of Christianity. He had a good understanding. He knew how vehemently the Jews opposed it. He knew how much political unrest. If he announced today, Paul is not guilty, and let him off, he'd have a mess on his hands. He really was just afraid to make a decision. He really just wanted to kick the can. Again, we talk about politics. Kicking the can down the road is exactly what he was doing. I'll just make this decision later. And he wanted somebody else to take the fall. He wanted Claudius Lysias to come and get his way in, because some people don't want to take the fall by themselves, right? So I want somebody else to come and join me. So we're just going to wait a while. And so he commanded Paul to be taken back to jail. He told them, "Let guests come, let them bring him food. We're not going to treat him poorly. Just keep him under wraps and let him have visitors along the way." However, the delay led to an opportunity for Paul to witness while in chains, or minister while in chains. Felix had a wife by the name of Drusilla. She was one of the three daughters of King Agrippa. She had been promised to Epiphanes, who was the son of Antiochus, only if he consented to become Jewish, and he would not do that. So she ended up marrying Azazus, who did consent to become Jewish, but then she was wooed away by Felix. All right, so now she is with Felix, and I don't know how anyone is wooed away by somebody named Felix, but she was. And Felix had been married 3 times. So you got Drusilla, who had been unfaithful to Azazus, who didn't marry Epiphanes because he didn't become a Jew, and she gets wooed away by Felix, and she is now with Felix, and this is Felix's 3rd wife. And but they want to hear Paul talk more. So kind of interesting fella. So let's bring him in, and Paul talk to them some more. And so Paul, hey, you ask, I'm going to preach the gospel to you. And this is part of his ministry and change. You wanted to hear? Let me tell you. And so Paul preaches to them. And he declares to them the righteousness of God, and the judgment to come, and the need for self-control. And you can imagine that probably made old Felix feel a little bit convicted, right? You know, it's like he didn't have any self-control, and apparently Drusilla didn't have much either. And they're talking about righteousness, and he's all of these things. Felix is convicted, and so ultimately he procrastinates even further. And he says, I'll wait for a convenient time to have you come back. I'll listen some more, but right now is not the moment. Now, to be fair to the text, I think partly out of conviction, but the text says he also thought maybe there's a bribe in this for him. He thought, you know, if I kind of just keep playing with Paul, maybe eventually, because I have let Paul's friends come and see, maybe they'll slip him some money, and maybe he'll bribe me to get out. And so all of these things are going on in Felix's head, but he procrastinates, and he leaves Paul in prison for 2 years. But there apparently is many times, or sometimes, that Paul has an audience with Felix and Drusilla again, and every time he is sharing the gospel with them. So that's the end of Felix's little experience with Paul. Are there any comments or questions, insights? Again, it's just a fairly straightforward narrative, but we don't often talk about these kind of things. Anybody, any thoughts or questions, comments? Anybody want to talk about baptism today or anything like that? Just kidding. All right. Chapter 25 then. So, verse 1, when Festus had come to the province after 3 days, so now Festus is going to take over for Felix. So after he comes to the province, after 3 days, he went up to Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him, Paul, to Jerusalem. And again, their plan was to lay an ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. So again, a lot of politics here. This is the political structure of the day. So Felix retires, and Festus is going to take over. After 3 days of being in office, Festus makes a pretty shrewd political move, and that is he's going to go to Jerusalem and meet the Jewish leaders. He's going to now be ruling over them. He's taking over for Felix. He's the new guy. And so he wants to meet. This is just if you were the brand new governor, you'd want to meet the leaders of the different groups in your community. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to meet with the Jewish leaders. And so he goes down to meet them in Jerusalem. And immediately, what do they say? We want a favor from you. You've got a prisoner back there in Caesarea by the name of Paul. And he is from Tarsus. And we couldn't get Felix to do anything. Now you're the new guy. And so they start pressuring Festus, and they said to Festus, we would like for you to bring, this didn't work with Felix, but we would like for you to bring Paul back to Jerusalem so we can try him. And of course the text says what was their plan. If they did that, they were going to ambush him. They were going to kill him. To which Festus says, it's not necessary. I'm going to be headed back to Caesarea soon, and if you all want this to happen, then you come to Caesarea and you hold another trial in Caesarea, and I'll listen, but we're not going to travel, and we're not going to spend, trying to make this fun, we're not going to spend taxpayer money to ship him back to Jerusalem, all right? You're going to spend your own money to come to Caesarea, all right? So he says we're not going to do that, and partly out of convenience for, he didn't want to mess with the travel plans, but obviously you see the hand of God in this as well, because their plan was they were going to ambush Paul and kill him. But what had God told Paul? You're going to go to Rome. And so God's plan is he's going to make it to Rome. And so he intervenes, and Festus says, no, we're not going to do that. You're going to have to come where I am, and that's where you can try Paul again. So verse 6 then, the trial convenes in verse number 6. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, then he went back to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, that word is bema seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which again they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. So again, it's the same thing. We don't have to go into great detail, but they brought the same charges against him. He caused a riot 2 years ago, and he profaned the temple 2 years ago, and he doesn't care for the law, all that. And again, Paul said, I've not done any of that. And he just defended himself. I didn't cause a riot. I didn't create a mob. I've done none of that. So then in verse 9, Paul will make an appeal. Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, wanting to do a political favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" So now Festus is saying, okay, I want to get the Jews on my side. They wanted him in Jerusalem in their jurisdiction. So he says to Paul, "Are you willing to do me a favor?" He knew that Paul was a Roman citizen. "Are you willing to do me a favor, and we'll go back and we'll have, you say you didn't do anything. They say you did some things. I can't sort it out here. Are you willing to go back and have your trial there?" To which Paul answers in verse 10. So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat." In other words, Festus, you are representing Rome. I am standing before the representative of Caesar, Roman's judgment seat, and this is where I ought to be judged. In other words, I'm in the right place. To the Jews, I've done no wrong, as you very well know. If I'm an offender or I've committed anything deserving of death, I don't object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver them to me. I appeal to Caesar. All right? So Paul said, "Listen, Festus, I appreciate you asking if I go to Jerusalem, but let me tell you how I feel about this thing. I am a Roman citizen, and I am right where I belong. I am in front of a Roman court. I don't belong in front of a Jewish court because, as I've told you, you've heard me testify. They don't have any eyewitnesses. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't break any Jewish law, so I don't need to be before them. And so I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not doing you a favor. I'm not going back to Jerusalem, but I am going to appeal to Caesar." And verse 12, Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "You've appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go." So Paul is granted that request. Interestingly, he should have been acquitted, but there was no proof of any wrong. Festus wanted to help the Jews, so he took the blindfold off of justice. Festus tries to get Paul to go, and Paul responds, "No, I'm appealing to Caesar." So Festus grants that request after conferring with the council. But now here's something that this is going to lead us into the next section. He's got to send a report. If he's going to send them to Caesar, he's got to say something. I mean, Caesar's going to want to know, why is this guy here? And so Festus has to write a report and come up with some reason to have sent Paul to stand before Rome, and he really had nothing. So we get to verse 13. So now Festus is kind of in trouble. He said, "You're going to go to Caesar, but what am I going to tell Caesar you did? I'm not sure what this is going to be about." So verse 13, after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, and they wanted a judgment against him. To them I answered, it's not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay the next day, I sat on the judgment seat, and I commanded the man to be brought to us. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of things that I had supposed. But they had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, I would also like to hear the man for myself. And so Festus said, tomorrow you shall hear him. All right, so the plot thickens a little bit here. King Agrippa and his wife Bernice, they come to meet the new governor. All right, they're paying their respects. They're honoring Festus, and they're there several days. And Agrippa is accompanied by his sister. And as they're talking, Festus says, hey, let me tell you about this case I got. I mean, that's how this conversation goes. I got this guy in jail, that Felix, and I'm sure they said a few tough things about Felix being lazy and procrastinating and leaving his mess with me. I mean, you can just imagine. Felix left this guy in jail, this Paul guy, and the Jews wanted me to judge him. They wanted me to execute him, but I can't execute somebody unless I've heard the case. And so I invited them to come and give the case. And when I heard the case, it wasn't anything like I expected. I mean, I thought they were going to have something big against the guy. And all I got is that he profaned their temple, and he says he didn't do it. It's, he said, she said, only it's he in this case. And that's all they got. And then this thing about this Jesus guy that died and rose from the dead. But, I mean, Festus is saying, Agrippa, I don't think I ought to be executing anybody for that. That just, yeah, Linda? I was on a roll, Linda. I was telling you the story really good. Just kidding. Go ahead. It would be another Agrippa. There are like 3 Agrippas. Yes. When I went on my roll. Okay, very good. Not sure I can get back on it now, Linda, but I will try. I'm trying to make this story that's not, all that exciting fun. All right, okay. So he says, what I heard was not what I had expected at all. And he's teaching about this dead man named Jesus that he says is alive. And again, notice, that's at the core of this. And I am going to take a quick little pause. That's what bothers people today. If Jesus really died and really resurrected, then he is really who he says he is. Nobody else has done that. And so since he did that, and if he's really who he says he is, then he really is Lord. And the problem with having a real Lord is you have to obey. Do you understand? At the core of our world's problem is they don't want to answer to anyone. But if someone really rose from the dead, you got to answer to it. So that's why, I mean, people are not going to argue about, I mean, they might, but they're not. Nobody's going to get too bent out of shape about pre, mid, or post-tribulation. They're not going to say, I'm not going to believe that. They're not going to get too bent out of shape about spirit baptism or sanctification. But the world gets bent out of shape about the resurrection of Jesus, because all of a sudden that changes everything, all right? So that's the issue here. And so not only is that the issue, that's the issue Paul keeps bringing back at them. I mean, Felix finally said, I'll wait till a convenient time. And now Festus, and he's going to give it to Agrippa. It's like, hey, I'm laying out for you Christ risen. What are you going to do with it? That's what am I going to do with the resurrection of Christ? At the end of the day, that's the question we all have to answer. And so, now Festus is explaining to Agrippa, I got this problem, I don't know what to do. I'm supposed to send him off to Rome, but I got to write something up, and I don't know what to say about him. And he's just telling Agrippa over a cup of coffee, and Agrippa says, I'd like to hear this guy. I'd like to hear what he's got to say. And so, curious Agrippa is going to get his way. Verse 23. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. When I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. But I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially you, King Agrippa, so that after examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. So really, Festus says, I need your help here, Agrippa, because I got to write a letter with this guy saying why he's being sent. And I'm kind of a new governor in this Roman structure here. And if I mess up my first big case, I may be in trouble with Caesar. So I'd really like your help in forming this explanation as to why he has been sent. A couple of things I just wanted to note. Notice when Agrippa and Bernice come in, it is with great pomp, all right? So there's like royalty, there's probably music, they're flowing robes, everybody stands. And when Paul comes in, he's in chains. And yet Paul is the preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a man who suffered so much for the cause of Christ. But you really get that sense of what Jesus is talking about. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. If a man loves his life, he's going to lose it. But if he loses his life, he'll find it. All of that. I want to know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. All of that's going on here. Paul doesn't feel demeaned by walking in chains while the other guys walk in their pomp and circumstance, because Paul knows that someday, there's a crown of righteousness reserved for him, and someday he is going to be rewarded for what he's done. But it's just a really kind of an ironic picture as he walks in. Amy? Agrippa would be similar to the Herods. I'm not similar to, would be of that same family line. They would be Edomites, which would be from the lineage of Esau. They are so therefore partially Jew, and they would be puppet kings of the Roman Empire over the Jews. So he would not. His jurisdiction would have been the Jews only. But Festus knew that he's got some insight that I would not have. All right? Okay. Any other questions? That's a great question. Anybody else? Yeah, Linda?
I just want to say that I was reminded of the time when Princess Diana died, and the pomp and circumstance in that, and also at the same time, Mother Teresa died.
Yeah.
And I was just reminded of that picture,
Sure.
It happened at the same time.
Right.
And yet the pomp and circumstance came with the princess, the royal.
Sure.
And yet here was Mother Teresa who
That's a great point.
has life eternal.
Yep.
And not as much here on earth.
Sure.
Like,
That's a good point. So he is hoping that Agrippa, who is familiar with Judaism, is going to help him. This is not an official trial. Agrippa has no authority to conduct a trial. Festus just needs to file a report and send it to Caesar, and he's really just asking for Agrippa's help. So now we get to chapter 26, and verse number 1. Agrippa said to Paul, "You're permitted to speak." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. They know me from the first, if they were willing to testify, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and I'm judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. To this promise, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I'm accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? He is going to really put the screws to Agrippa and force him to do something with his resurrection thing. So he begins his defense. Agrippa says, okay, Paul, you can talk. Paul acknowledges, Agrippa, you're here because you're an expert in the laws of the Jews. He reminds him of his strict upbringing. And notice what he says. if they were really honest with you, those who are bringing charges against me know how strictly I was raised. If they were willing to testify, they would say, I have been raised in the strictest of the Pharisee heritage. And his point is, they really aren't being honest. They know how orthodox I am. He describes that his life of piety has continued, and the charges of his accusers are without base. He acknowledges that the basis of their accusation against him is that he is hoping for the resurrection at the end of the day, of the end of the world, the same hope that all of those Jews accusing him themselves had. He said, they are accusing me, again, he's talking about the Pharisees, not the Sadducees. They're accusing me of laying hold of this hope that Jacob longed for, that Isaac longed for, that Abraham longed. They're accusing me. I'm in jail. I'm in prison, and they want to execute me because I believe the same thing that we were all raised to believe, that there is hope after this life. And then he says, and not just hope in this life, the hope of the Messiah. Okay, now, certainly there's a question about who is the Messiah. They rejected it's Jesus, but the hope of a Messiah was the hope shared by all the Jews. So Paul is saying, I find it pretty odd that they're wanting to execute me for hoping for the same thing they're hoping for. See what he's doing with this. And then to Agrippa, he says, you should have no problem, Agrippa, believing this. You should have no problem believing this yourself. Now, it seems, if you go back to chapter 25 and verse number 19, speaking of Felix here, he had some questions against such things as I suppose. This is what, Festus says. He had some questions against them about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was died, who Paul affirmed to be alive. Festus didn't have a frame of reference for that. He didn't get it. But he says to Agrippa, this shouldn't surprise you. You should know all about this. So he goes on, part 2 of his defense, beginning in verse number 9. We're in chapter 26, verse 9. Indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. He's just telling his own story. This I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them, and I punished them often in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. So now he's just saying, Agrippa, this is what I did before I was saved. Before I was converted, I struggled with this whole idea of Jesus as Messiah. So, Paul is almost saying, I get it. I too struggled with Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah. And before my conversion, I was involved in this broad effort to stamp the way out. But then he says, verse 12, while I was thus occupied, stamping the way out, as I journeyed to Damascus, this is the 4th time we have read this, not this, but this story. We've read it other places. I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priest. I had authority. I had search warrants, all right, authority to get Christians. I was on my way to do that at midday, verse 13. O king, along the road I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me, and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. So I said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and witness both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So Paul said, I had a hard time with Jesus as Messiah as well. I was killing Christians, persecuting them. But then I had this experience, and this light struck me down, and all of us fell to the ground. And then this voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I said, who are you, Lord? Now watch this. And he said, I am Jesus. So this becomes Paul's historical evidence for the resurrection of Christ. Somebody dead didn't speak. He spoke to me and said he was Jesus. And Paul says, this changed my life. This is the clearest exposition of the significance of the resurrection. Paul said he totally turned me around. Paul has already said, if these guys would tell you the truth, they know how bad I was. They know how much I hated these Christians. I didn't just one day wake up and say, hey, I think I'll go on the other side. I was vehemently opposed to Christianity, but I encountered Jesus. And because I encountered Christ, I'm now willing to be executed. If you want to execute me, I'm not changing my mind because I met the resurrected Lord. He is giving this powerful exposition of the resurrected Christ. It's the third time he's recounted his experience. And again, notice he is using that to point people to the hope of salvation in Jesus. I mean, he's telling Agrippa, you kind of know this hope for a Messiah thing. And I'm telling you, this is the one. This is the one. You got a chance. He will even later try to reel him in. And then Paul says in verse 19, verse number 19, I flipped my page here too far, sorry. We are in chapter 26, right? Is that where we're at? Okay. Verse 19, therefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. After that, I mean, he's saying, Agrippa, I could not tell people about Jesus. He changed me. So I wasn't disobedient to the heavenly vision, but I declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and then throughout all of Judea, and then to the Gentiles. And I told them that they should repent and turn to God and do works befitting repentance. For these reasons, this is the reason, it's about this Jesus guy. These reasons the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. Therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand, witnessing both to the small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that the Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, and he would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. This is it is so succinct and so eloquent. He says, I am standing here suffering for the very things that we all were taught as a kid would happen. That we would have a Messiah that would suffer. Or at least that the prophets said. I don't know that the Jews understood it, but the prophets said. I mean, can I just give you one example? I'm standing here, Paul says, ready to be executed because I chose to believe in the one who fulfills our own prophet's words. He was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace is upon him, and by his stripes we're healed. Written 700 years before Christ. Paul said, you're wanting to execute me for believing in what we were always told was going to happen. I mean, he's just making it really simple, so articulate. As Paul said, I had to do what I was called to do. I did it with both Jew and Gentile. And Paul says to Agrippa, that's why they got me in the temple. That's the message they were rejecting. And he said, everything that's I'm preaching was foretold in the prophets. And then in verse 24, we're going to wind this down for the day. Now as he thus made his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. All right? A lot of people think we're crazy to believe in the resurrected Christ. That's not an untypical response. You're crazy. All this learning's made you mad. Paul's response, verse 25, I'm not mad, most noble Festus. See how kind he was? I'm not mad, but I speak the words of truth and reason. For the king before whom I also speak freely knows these things. He split the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and now he's trying to divide Festus and Agrippa. He says, you think I'm mad, but if he would really be honest with you, that king sitting next to you, he knows I'm telling the truth. That's what he's saying. He knows I'm not crazy. And, I love that kind of stuff. So he said, I'm not mad. The king before whom I also speak knows these things. I'm convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. In other words, that guy sitting next to you, he knew about this Jesus that got crucified. He's an insider. He knows that the tomb was empty. He knows that. He knows that the Jews didn't want anybody to know that, so they concocted a story that the body was stolen. He knows all that. He knows about the earthquake that day when he said it is finished. He knows all that. He may be acting like he doesn't know to you, Festus, but he knows. I'm telling you, if you could get him in a room and he would, swear you to secrecy, he'd tell you. He knows what I'm saying is true. And he's pushed his buttons a little bit now, and he goes for the jugular with Agrippa. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? And then he even said, he answered for him, I know you believe. All right? He's really putting the screws to Agrippa. And then in verse 28, Agrippa said to Paul, and there's so many different translations of this, so I don't know exactly what to do with this. Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. Now, I will tell you that makes great preaching, and it may be what he said. We're not really sure. Some translations say that Agrippa said, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? Some translations even say, are you trying to play me as a Christian? So we're not really sure, and it's hard to translate. It's a tough Greek phrase that really can be translated any of those ways. But at the end of the day, we do see that Agrippa knew exactly what Paul was talking. Not saying he believed, not saying that he embraced. I'm saying we can sense that Paul had adequately and effectively pushed Agrippa to the point of decision. So if he was saying, you almost persuaded me, that would be, you almost persuaded me. If he said, in a short time do you persuade me, it's like, same thing. Are you trying to get me to make a decision now without really thinking about it? If he said, are you trying to play me as a Christian? Do you think I've already given in? I mean, all of those answers, all of those translations kind of point back to the same thing. Agrippa knew what Paul was driving at. All right, he knew what Paul was driving at. He knew the stories. It's right down to this. Agrippa knew enough to make a decision. Now, even people can believe. The demons believe, right? The Bible says that. So I don't even know if we're talking about a belief issue. We're talking about, am I going to cross over and say, I'm going to give my life for this? I'm not even sure that Agrippa hadn't put all the numbers together, but he's thinking, okay, I lose my clout, I lose my position, I may be executed. Am I really willing? So that's the point that Paul has driven him to. You got Festus over here saying you're crazy. And Paul said, well, you may think that, but let me tell you, the guy sitting next to you doesn't think I'm crazy. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. Don't you, Agrippa? You believe, don't you, Agrippa? And so Paul is again, this is ministry in chains. He is pointing them to the gospel. And then so he responds, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. And then Paul says, it's kind of funny because I think there is some humor in this. Paul says, verse 29, I would to God that not only you, but also everybody who hears me today might become both almost and altogether as I am. And then he basically says, but I wouldn't wish on any of you to be in prison. All right, that's what he said, except for these chains. I'm not looking for an almost out of you. I wish everybody in this room would be like me and would believe like me, but I don't wish on any of you to have to be in this position to be potentially executed for what I'm believing, but I do wish that you would surrender. And then the rulers looked at one another. Verse 30, when he had said these things, the king stood up, as well as the governor and Bernice and those who sat with them. And when they had gone aside, they talked among themselves, saying, this man is doing nothing deserving of death. Then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So whatever pressure that Paul was putting on Agrippa and whatever Holy Spirit conviction Agrippa may have felt, he was able to push it aside. He stood up. We've all seen that happen to people time and time again. The Holy Spirit is convicting them, but they won't surrender. He didn't, and then he got business, all business as usual. And he says, well, I don't really see anything that this man should be executed for. And he says, and this is where we'll pick up next week in the last lesson, he says, actually, really this ought to be the end of the road. He's not guilty. And had he not appealed to Caesar, he'd be walking today. That's what he says. He'd be walking today. But once appealed to Caesar, you would be offending Caesar not to bring Paul before you. And so they didn't have an out. To Caesar he must go. And we'll pick that up next week.